right, so let's go ahead and get started. Our part 1 section, our hands-on section. We're actually going to start this section in chapter 3, our essential calculations chapter. That's going to be on page 25. So go ahead and find page 25 or chapter 3 in either your physical or digital book. Now, this chapter is going to be focusing on our volume, or the number of gallons of water inside our pool or our hot tub. Now, this is a great baseline. We're starting at the very foundations, and figuring out how many gallons of water you have inside of your pool or your hot tub is by far one of the best places to start. Now, the question is, why do we need to know how many gallons of water we have inside of our pool or our hot tub? Well, as we can see, first and foremost, all of our chemical adjustments require our understanding and knowledge of exactly how many gallons of water we have inside of that pool or that hot tub. Without knowing this number, we're going to be either overdosing or underdosing. Now, realistically, a lot of us, especially those of us who are new on the property, are going to get inside of that pump room. We're going to look on the pump room wall, and somebody will have written in Bic pen or Sharpie or something like that a number of how many gallons are inside that pool or that hot tub. Now, for us who see that and are new at the property, we have no idea if that's true or that's false. So I always recommend that you do the calculations yourself. Now, we are going to be going over exactly how to calculate those on our own in just a few minutes, but that's my recommendation because, again, you want to make sure that you are properly dosing your pools so you're not overdoing it or underdoing it in some ways. Now, the next reason why volume is so important is for something called bather load. Now, it's good to know that there's a difference between capacity and bather load. Now, capacity is the number of people who are legally allowed to be in that pool or that hot tub at a given time. Bather load, on the other hand, is the number of people you can get inside of that pool or hot tub before that body of water starts to get overwhelmed by the sheer amount of bodies in there. Now, it's good to remember that the average human compromises the disinfectant in 600 gallons of water. That means that whatever they're bringing with them inside of that body of water is going to be killed off by the disinfectant in there. But as a result, that disinfectant is essentially going to dissipate. It's no longer going to have that residual inside the water. So let's put this into perspective. Let's say that we've got a 1,200-gallon spa. And if we know that the average person is going to compromise 600 gallons of disinfected water, how many people can get inside of that hot tub before there is no disinfectant residual? The answer is 2. But if you look on the wall, the capacity for that hot tub in this situation is going to be between 3 and 5. That means that the third, the fourth, and the fifth person who come in, whatever they bring in with them, they are now freely spreading out to everybody else inside of that hot tub. Now, this is reason number 1 why you will never swim in another hot tub after this course, but you can thank me later for that. Now, let's go ahead and jump in and figure out exactly how to do these calculations of figuring out how many gallons of water we have inside of our facility. So go ahead and pull out that flimsy workbook, the little thin guy, and we're going to open that up to page 2. Now, if you haven't printed this off yet, I highly recommend that you get it printed. You have a physical copy in your hand because we are going to be working on these together. Now, go ahead and look over on page 2. And you're going to see that the third element down on the list is going to be our pool volume calculation. Now, above that, we've got our surface area calculation and our average depth calculation. You'll notice in the pool volume calculation that both of those understandings are required. So we're going to build on that knowledge in order to be able to get to the proper pool volume understanding. The calculation for pool volume is going to be simply length times width times the average depth of the pool times 7.5. Length times width times the average depth times 7.5. Now, length times width is going to show the surface area of that pool. The average depth is going to show the depth inside the pool because obviously it does have volume to it. And that 7.5 represents the number of gallons per cubic foot inside of your pool. Again, the 7.5 represents the number of gallons per cubic foot inside of your pool. So without that constant, we have no idea how many gallons we have inside of our pool. Now that we've explored this calculation, let's put it to good use. Over on page 3 at the top, you are going to see your first calculation. It reads, your pool is 40 feet long by 20 feet wide, and the depth is 3 to 8 feet. What is the pool volume? Now, this test question, this example question, is very similar to one that you may come up on the exam. The good news is it gives us all the information that we need to be able to figure this out. First and foremost, with our length times width, all we do is plug that in. So first, let's do the 40 feet long, and the width is 20 feet. Now let's get to that average depth. The way that we calculate the average depth is we are going to take the shallow end plus the deep end and divide that number by 2. The shallow end plus the deep end and divide that number by 2. So in this situation, the shallow end is 3 feet, the deep end is 8 feet. If we take 3 plus 8, that gives us 11. We take 11, divide it by 2, and that gives us 5.5 feet, which is going to show us our average depth in this situation. Now, for those of you who may be using certain calculators, one of the big things to remember with this is once you plug in that shallow end plus that deep end, make sure that you're hitting equals on your calculator, because in this situation, if you were just to do 3 plus 8 divided by 2, because your calculator is following that order of operations, it's actually going to give you 7, which is incorrect. So what you want to do is make sure you do 3 plus 8, equal that out to 11, then divide that by 2, which is going to give you 5.5. So let's go ahead and plug that into our calculation. We also add down in there, or include down in there, our constant of 7.5. So right now we have 40 times 20 times 5.5 times 7.5. Calculate that all the way across, and you should come up with 33,000 gallons. And that's the way you figure out how many gallons of water you have inside of a rectangular body of water. Fairly straightforward. Now again, like we said earlier, if I went too fast, if things got confusing there, don't hesitate to rewind this video and watch it again as many times as you need in order for this to sink in. Now let's move on to a round spa. Now, a round spa has a little bit of a different calculation. You'll go back over to page 2 on your workbook, and right below the pool volume, you're going to see our spa volume calculation. That spa volume calculation is radius times 3.14 times our depth times 7.5. And that's going to give you the volume. Again, that's radius times 3.14 times our depth times 7.5. For those of you who are math enthusiasts out there, you're going to see that this is pi r squared is what we're working on at first. Now, the way that this is going to work is, remember that the radius is half the diameter. The diameter is the measurement all the way across that circular body of water. The diameter is the measurement all the way across the circular body. The radius is half of that number. So another thing to consider with our spas is, as you can see on the slide here, we have a very funky shape compared to our swimming pools. Notice how we have a seating area where the trunk of the body goes, and then we've got a footwell area where our feet dangle down. And as we can see, those have two very different diameters to them. Now, there are ways to calculate this all together, but I highly recommend that you make things easy for yourself. Work smarter, not harder in this situation. And I recommend that you calculate the seating area and the footwell as two separate spa areas. Now, you'll see on the screen, as well as in the workbook here, that I've labeled these Part A and Part B. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to separate those apart. We're going to calculate Part A, then we're going to calculate Part B and add those two numbers together. So let's go ahead and do that. On page 3 of your workbook, you're going to see our example question. It reads that your spa diameter is 10 feet. Your seating depth is 1.5 feet. The footwell diameter is 6 feet and has a depth of 1.5 feet. What is the spa volume? we have all of the numbers that we need to figure this question out. So let's go ahead and calculate that spa area A. Now remember, the question tells us the diameter of that top section. The diameter of the top section is 10 feet. So to find the radius, we're going to divide that number by 2, and we'll discover that the radius is 5 feet. So now we need to do radius times radius. So 5 times 5 times our 3.14, our constant, times our depth. Now remember, what's the depth in this section? The test question tells us it's 1.5 feet. So let's plug in our 1.5. And then we also need to include our 7.5, our constant. So let's do that math all the way across. 5 times 5 times 3.14 times 1.5 times 7.5. Once you do that calculation, you should come to 883 gallons. 883 gallons for that top section. That's great. Now let's put that over to the side and calculate the spa area B. Now, spa area B, according to our test question, says that it has a diameter of 6 feet. So what is our radius? If you said 3, you are correct. 3 feet. So now we're going to plug that radius in, 3 times 3, times our magic number of pi, 3.14, times our depth. Now the test question tells us what the depth here is, which is 1.5 feet, times 7.5. So let's do that math all the way across. 3 times 3 times 3.14 times 1.5 times 7.5. And what do you get? If you calculated it correctly, you should get 317 gallons and some change. Since it's above that 0.5, let's go ahead and round up. Now, on the exam, sometimes they may choose to round up, or they may choose to round down in a situation. But don't worry. In a situation like you would see here, the answer wouldn't be 317, 318, 319, and 320 as far as your multiple choice options go. Instead, it's going to be something like 317, 4,000, 221, and 1. So clearly you'll know that they've decided to round up or round down in that situation. But just be prepared for that when you see it on the exam. Now is the easy part. All we do is take spa area A and spa area B and add those two numbers together. So we're going to take 883 gallons plus our 318 gallons, and that should equal out, if you do the math correctly, to 1,201 gallons, 1,200 gallons essentially. You have a 1,200 gallon spa on your hands at your property. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Chapter 10, Water Circulation. We're going to jump over to page 119. Page 119. Now, in this chapter, we're going to be covering 3 different concepts. First, we're going to be talking about turnover rate. Next, we're going to be talking about flow rate. And then finally, we're going to do an overview of our circulation components. Now, before we get started, it's good to remember that in order for our pools and our hot tubs to stay healthy, the water needs to be moving. The slower the water moves, the more like a swamp it's going to become. These 3 different components that we're about to talk about is going to help us understand how our water moves and stays less like a swamp. So first, let's go ahead and turn our attention towards turnover rate. Now, our turnover rate is defined by the book as the time that it takes to move the number of gallons equal to the volume in the pool through the filtration equipment one time. That's a really fancy way of saying the time that it takes to move all of our water, to push all of our pool water through the filtration equipment once. This is our turnover rate. Now, we measure this in hours. This measurement is actually given to us by our health departments. This isn't something that we come up with arbitrarily out of the blue. We are given a requirement by our specific health departments. Now, here in the state of Colorado, as well as on a more of a national standard level, this is what our turnover rates look like. So for our swimming pool, with the swimming pool, it's required that our water be pushed through the filter entirely one time every 6 hours. With a hot tub or a spa, it's every 30 minutes. Swimming pools are every 6 hours, and hot tubs are every 30 minutes. Those are the numbers that you want to make sure that you remember. You might want to write those down on the page 10 section of notes in your workbook, just as a good reminder for you. Now, for those of you out there who may be working on wader pools, baby pools, or kiddie pools, they're all kind of the same thing. They just have different names. You're going to be at a 1 hour turnover rate on that. A 1 hour turnover rate. Anybody who has splash pads or specialty parks or water parks, you're going to be at a 1 hour turnover rate on those as well. Anybody who is working on a therapy pool is going to be at a 3 hour turnover. Now, for those of you out there who are working at your facility, I want you guys to take note of that hospital's number or that therapy pool number that we just talked about. A lot of us will be working at a property and they've labeled our hot tub as a therapy pool to make it sound super fancy. But the reality is a therapy pool is designed for specifically and exclusively for physical therapy inside of a medical facility. That's what a therapy pool is designated as. It runs about 94 degrees and the only purpose is for the physical therapy. So if you get to your property and your hot tub is at 104 degrees and there's jets running inside of it, but you see on the wall it says therapy pool, you can know they're just trying to make the facility sound fancy, but it's actually just a hot tub. So again, like I said, the big numbers that you're going to want to think about for the future is the swimming pool number and the spa number. Swimming pools need to turn over or have their water pushed through the filter one time every 6 hours, hot tubs once every 30 minutes. Now, you may be asking yourself, Alex, why do we need these turnover rates? Now, that's a great question. Like I said earlier, these aren't just arbitrary numbers. In fact, there's science backing these numbers. As you can see on screen, this matches very similarly to what you're going to see on page 120 in your book. Now, if you read that caption underneath this photo, it doesn't necessarily add a lot of insight into what we're looking at. But what I want you to think about here is dilution. So as you can see, after the first turnover, we're going to be at 63% filtered and 37% unfiltered water. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's think about the way that our swimming pools work when it comes to circulation. We're not shoving 100% of that water through the filter all at once. Instead, it's going to be going into our PVC lines, it's going to be running through the filter, and it's going to be shooting back out into the swimming pool. And once it shoots back out into the swimming pool as filtered water, it's going to be commingling with unfiltered water in there. Now remember, when our drain outlets, our suction lines, pull more water in to feed into the filter, this time they could be dragging some unfiltered water in with them, but they could also be dragging some already filtered water in for a trip a second time. So as we can see, that's why these rates go down the way that they do on a slower level between the second, third, and then finally at the fourth, we're at 98% filtration, is because we're basically diluting the water with filtered water over time. Now, one of the things that I want us to notice is it does take us 4 turnover rates to get to that 98% filtration. So let's do the math here. If each one of these turnovers takes 6 hours, and it takes 4 turnovers for us to get to 98% filtration, how many hours does it take for us to get to 98% filtration? So we're going to look at 6 hours times 4 turnovers. That's going to give us 24 hours. So that means that you need to be running your pools and your hot tubs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during your operating season. If that's only during the summer, that's the day you open in May to the day you close in September. If you're year-round, that's 24/7, 365. Now again, the reason why we need to do that is to make sure that we are properly and continually filtering our water. Now, how do we figure out if we're actually hitting this turnover rate of every 6 hours on a pool and every 30 minutes on a hot tub? It's not like we can stick our finger down in the water and say, yep, that water's moving fast enough to be able to figure it out. No, we actually need to be able to calculate this. Now, if you turn over to page 2 in your workbook, on page 2 of your workbook, Towards the bottom there, you're going to see our turnover rate calculation. Now let's go ahead and look at this a little bit more in depth. The way that we figure out if our pool is hitting our turnover rate is we are going to take our pool volume divided by our flow meter reading divided by 60. Again, that's our pool volume divided by our flow meter reading divided by 60. Now we've talked about the pool volume, but what's this flow meter that I'm talking about? Now, when you get into your pump room, what you're going to be looking for is a little transparent tower that's sticking off of one of your PVC pipes running back out into your pool. In this transparent tower, you're going to see a bunch of numbers printed on the side and a little float, a little silver bullet floating inside there. And this is your flow meter. This shows you at how quickly your water is moving in gallons per minute. Now, we're going to be talking about that flow meter here in just a few minutes, and the reason why it almost seems like this is backwards, the way that I'm explaining this, but I want to commit to going as chronologically through the book as possible, and this is the way that they lay it out inside of the handbook for you guys, so I don't want to be jumping all over, so I'm doing this first, but trust me, that flow meter is going to make more sense once we talk about our flow meter readings in the next section. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk into my pump room, I'm going to look at that flow meter. I'm going to take note of how many gallons per minute it's reading, and then I'll be able to calculate here. So let's do an example question here. So on the screen, you can see that I have a pool that's 100,000 gallons, and it has a flow rate of 280 gallons per minute. The question is, what is the turnover rate for that pool? So let's do our calculation. Pool volume divided by flow rate divided by 60. So our pool volume is 100,000 gallons. Our flow meter reading, or our flow rate, is 280 gallons per minute. And we divide that by 60. So let's go ahead and do that math. 100,000 divided by 280 divided by 60. And what do you get? If you do the calculation correctly, you should end up somewhere around 5.9 hours. We'll round that up to 6 hours. So the question is, on our swimming pool, are we within code? Well, if you remember those numbers we talked about earlier, we are absolutely within code because we are under that 6-hour mark. Now remember, with our swimming pools, it's 6 hours. With hot tubs, it's 30 minutes. There's a reason why I'm pounding that number into our brains over and over, is because we're going to be using that continually, not only in our job, but also maybe on an exam that's coming up. So keep that in mind. Now, one of the big things that I look at here, as an operator who has some experience, I'm at 5.9 turnover. I know that if I hit 6.1 hour turnover, if I get inspected, I could be shut down. If I hit 6.05 hours, I could be shut down as a result. We always need to stay under our required turnover rates. So for me as an operator, I look at this 5.9 number and I say, okay, well, at least I'm still in code, but I need to do some things inside the pump room in order to open my flow back up and give me a little bit more breathing space. Because if somebody who's got a dirty body jumps inside my pool or my hot tub, in this situation a swimming pool, and they've got that crummy stuff on them, it's going to clog up my filter, which is going to slow my water down, and then it's going to kick me out of that 6-hour turnover. So again, like I said, this is something that we're always going to be considering when we're looking at these turnovers. Now that we understand turnover, let's go ahead and talk about our flow rate. Our flow rate. Now, what is a flow rate in the first place? According to your handbook, this is the amount of water passing through the circulation system at a given time. The amount of water passing through the circulation system at a given time. This is basically the speed of your water. We measure this in gallons per minute. Now, how do we calculate our minimum flow? Now, let me slow down here and reiterate something about our flow rate. We're going to be checking our flow rate, or our gallons per minute that's running through our system, every single day according to our code. Realistically, flow rate is significantly more relevant to you as an operator than your turnover rates, because here's the reality, is if your flow rate that you've calculated is running above your minimum flow rate that we're about to calculate, you can already understand and know that your turnover rates are within code. If you need to rewind and let that sink in, feel free to do so. Essentially, as long as our flow rate is good to go, we can know that our turnover rates are being hit every single time. So let's go ahead and figure out how we calculate this minimum flow, the slowest our water can move before we get kicked out of our code requirement. So again, on page 2 of your workbook, towards the very bottom there, you're also going to see our flow rate calculation. This is our flow rate calculation. Now remember, we are calculating our minimum flow here. This is the slowest our water can move. Our calculation for this is pool volume divided by that turnover rate given to us by the state divided by 60. Now I'm going to pound our numbers again here. How many hours is our turnover rate for swimming pools? That's correct, 6 hours. How many hours is it for, or what is our time, I should say, for our hot tubs? That's right, 30 minutes. So let's go ahead and, for example, let's go ahead and calculate that 33,000 gallon pool that we had calculated the volume in earlier. Let's figure out what our minimum flow rate is on there. Now, on page 3 of your workbook, you're actually going to see a flow rate calculator. Feel free to use that in this situation. So let's take that 33,000 gallon pool. We'll plug that in the volume section. And now we need to divide that by our hours. How many hours do we need to divide this by if it's a swimming pool? If you said 6, that is correct. So go ahead and plug that 6 in there. We've already got our 60 in there, so let's go ahead and do the math all the way across. 33,000 divided by 6 divided by 60. And what does that give you? If you calculated 92 gallons per minute, that is correct. Now again, you're going to have 91 and some change, but we'll round up to 92 gallons per minute here. So every single time I go into my pump room, I should be eyeballing that flow meter, and if it reads 92 gallons per minute, I know that I'm good. If it reads anything less than that, then I know that I'm falling out of my flow rate code requirement, and as a result, my turnover rate requirement as well. Now, here's a little pro tip that I would recommend for everybody out there. Once you figure out what your minimum flow rate is, grab a red Sharpie. Go over to that flow meter and mark a line at your minimum flow rate. That way, when you walk into the pump room, you can eyeball that, see that it's floating above that line, and if it's floating above that line, you're good to go. If it's dropped down below that line, you know that you've got some work to do to figure out the problem. Now let's go ahead and do a spa calculation because it is a little bit different because remember, we're only at 30 minutes. So let's go ahead and take that 1,200 gallon spa that we calculated and figure out what our minimum flow rate is for our spa. All we do is plug in 1,200 divided by 30, and what does that give us? 1,200 divided by 30 should give you 40 gallons per minute. Again, as long as you are reaching your minimums, you should be just fine. Now let's go ahead and talk about our circulation components, all of the pieces of equipment that make this all work together. Now, as you can see on the screen here, we've got a sequence of events going. You're not going to be able to find this photo in your handbook, so just refer to it on the screen here. Now, the reason why I've put this up here is not because I expect all of your pump rooms to be laid out cleanly and pristinely like this, because the vast majority of us are working in glorified broom closets that are filled with just a bunch of pieces of equipment with a giant ball of PVC snakes inside there. So I'm not requiring it to look all laid out and perfect like this because that's usually what all of us are not working with. What I'm showing you is the sequence of events, the first, the second, third, so on and so forth, steps that your water takes on its journey through your circulation system. Now, as you can see on the screen here first, our water is going to exit through either our main drain or our skimmers. Once it exits through those outlets, it's going to then go into our pump and motor, followed by our filter, then through our heating system, and then finally through our chemical system, whether it's just a simple chlorinator or it's a fully automated chemical system. Now, the reason why I point this out is because sometimes you'll have companies that come in and plumb this incorrectly. For instance, they may put that chlorinator in between your filter and your heater. Now, if that happens, you can see some major issues coming from this, because that chlorinator is going to be kicking out really high concentrated amounts of chlorine right through your very sensitive copper heating element or heat exchanger inside of your heater. As a result, that's going to make your heater crap out significantly faster than if you were to put this in the proper sequence of events. So when you get back to your property, I highly recommend you walk through your pump room and make sure that your pump room follows this exact same sequence of events. So let's go ahead and focus in on specific elements within this sequence. The first thing we're going to talk about is the way that our water leaves our pools. Let's talk about our main drains. Now, the main drain is at the bottom of the pool there. Now, let's be realistic. This main drain is not like a drain at the bottom of your bathtub or at the bottom of your sink. Those run off of gravity. This is not a gravity drain, my friends. This is a bottom suction line. Now, the state of California is actually one of the only states that properly and accurately defines this inside of their code as a bottom suction line. Now, the reason why this is such an important piece of our puzzle is because we need to understand that this presents to us something called an entrapment hazard. An entrapment hazard. To figure out and understand entrapment hazards more, let's take a quick turn back in our books to page 266. Back into our Appendix C, page 266. This is where we are going to be exploring the Virginia Graham-Baker Pool and Spa Safety Act, also known as the VGB Code. Now let's talk entrapment first. What is entrapment? Well, there are 5 different forms of entrapment. The first one is body entrapment. As you can see on the slide, there are 4 victims of body entrapment. This means that they were able to go down and put the entirety of their body over that main drain, and as a result, they became sucked to that main drain. What does that suction look like? Well, if it's given the right circumstances, it can be between 500 and 700 pounds of suction force. So that means that somebody would have to be able to lift 500 to 700 pounds in order to pull that person off there. Now, at the risk of being crass, if we look at that with a young child, you're literally going to pull that child in half before you're able to get them off of that main drain entrapment like this. The second type of entrapment is hair entrapment. Now, you will see this in hot tubs primarily. Somebody's going to swim down to the bottom of that hot tub. Their hair will get entangled inside of that main drain grate. It will suck it in, and as a result, they won't be able to get out, and they drown as a result of that entrapment. Now, the third type of entrapment is known as evisceration or disembowelment. Really violent words for a very violent act. So, a few decades ago, there was a young kid by the name of William Boulay. Now, William Boulay was a 2.5-year-old boy, and he was swimming in a motel baby pool. He was able to get the cover off of the main drain because the service tech at the property did not properly adhere it to the main drain. So he was able to pop it off, and he sat his little booty down inside that main drain. Well, a few minutes later, his mom said it's time to get out of the pool, but he couldn't get out of the baby pool. His mom thought that he was playing a joke, so she went over and grabbed him and tried to lift him off, and he was stuck inside of the main drain hole. So she started to panic a little bit, and she called one of the maintenance crew over and said, we need to do something about this. So the maintenance guy ran down the entirety of the property, had to run out 2 double doors around the outside of the building into the pump room and shut the system off. By the time he had gotten there, William Boulay had lost 50% of his intestines through his anus by being sucked out from that main drain. This is evisceration. This does happen. And unfortunately, it still happens to this day. Now, the next one we're going to be talking about is limb entrapment. Back in 2008, there was a 16-year-old kid swimming in a backyard pool. He swam down to get a pool toy, saw that main drain cover, got a little curious, was able to pop it off, and he actually was able to get his arm down inside the main drain line. It sucked his arm all the way up to his shoulder blade through an 1 3/4 pipe and held him down to the bottom of that pool until he drowned and died as a result. Now, finally, we've got mechanical entrapment. This is if you get a bathing suit or goggles or something like that sucked to that main drain, and as a result, you can't get out. Now, again, this is a really intense topic, but it's an intense situation that is possible to happen inside of our pools. Now, up until 2002, there really was nothing, I should say actually up until 2007, there really was nothing stopping from anybody getting or having this issue occur. But back in 2002, there was a 7-year-old girl named Virginia Graham Baker who was swimming in a backyard hot tub during a birthday party. She got sucked to the bottom of that hot tub and ended up dying in her mom's arms by the side of the hot tub as a result of this entrapment. It was this little girl's life that finally caused things to change in the pool and spa industry. The reason why is because she was the granddaughter of former Secretary of State Jim Baker. A former politician saw that this was an issue and started to push through legislation as a result. Fast forward to 2007, the Virginia Graham Baker Pool and Spa Safety Act is signed into law. It requires that all public and semi-public pools comply with what is now known as the ANSI APSP 16 standard. Now, what is that ANSI APSP 16 standard? Well, it says that we need to protect our swimmers from this main drain entrapment. And it gives us some choices. It gives us some options. Now, as you can see on the slide, the first one that we see there is an 18 by 23-inch main drain cover. Now, this used to be a giant, what they call unblockable drain that you could retrofit over any sump inside of your facility. As of 2016, though, this has not become an option for 90% of us, even maybe 95% of us as operators, simply because the new code requirements require that our sump, that box at the bottom of the pool or the circular hole at the bottom of the pool, match our drain cover. So unless you have an 18 by 23-inch sump at the bottom of that pool, you are not eligible to be using an 18 by 23-inch unblockable drain cover. Now, the next item on there requires that you have 2 separate main drains, at least 3 feet apart from one another, and they need to be covered by anti-entrapment drain covers. So again, that's 2 main drains separated by 3 feet, covered by anti-entrapment drain covers. The theory behind this is if somebody swims down and covers one of those main drains with the entirety of their body, instead of being sucked to that main drain, the suction actually diverts over to the open main drain so that person does not get entrapped. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and this has never happened in the history of the swimming pool and spa industry, but the theory is that 2 people could swim down and each cover one of those main drain outlets and as a result get both of their bodies sucked to the main drains. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because this is why the APSP, the NSPF, the federal government, and us at Pool Training Academy all say that this does not eliminate main drain entrapment. It only mitigates it. It only mitigates it, which means that it lowers the chances. So then finally, our next choice is an anti-entrapment drain cover over a single main drain and a secondary anti-entrapment device installed on our system as well. So if you have a single main drain, it needs to be covered by an anti-entrapment drain cover, and it needs to have a secondary anti-entrapment device installed. Now, what do those secondary anti-entrapment devices look like? Well, we've got a couple of different options here. The first one on our list here on the slide is the Safety Vacuum Release System, or known as the SVRS. Now, a lot of our pumps and motors are already pre-installed with an SVRS system. Essentially, what this does is it shuts the pump off when it feels that suction impedance for more than a couple of seconds. These things are very effective, they're very good, and they work really well. The next is our suction limiting vent system. That's the photo that you see there. It's called a VAC alert. Now, one of the big things that we need to remember with our facilities is our pumps and motors need water inside of them in order to properly circulate. If air gets inside there and enough air gets inside there, it will cause that pump impeller or the heart of the system to seize up and stop circulating. So essentially what this suction limiting vent system does is it causes a valve to pop open and suck air down into your system. Once that air hits your impeller, it's going to stop the impeller and it's going to stop suction. So whatever is blocking that main drain is going to be able to swim off and swim away. We usually do not see these vac alerts inside of the commercial industry, though some of you who are working in backyard pools may experience these. The next one on our list is going to be a gravity drainage system. Now, the theory behind the gravity drainage system is it lives up to its title. It only works on gravity. That main drain does not connect to any suction lines. It's just gravity pulling it in to a secondary surge tank or holding tank where the water then begins to circulate through suction. So if you have a gravity drainage system, as long as it runs into a surge tank and is not connected to a suction line, you are able to consider yourself mitigated from any potential direct entrapment. Now, your final option as a secondary anti-entrapment device is an automatic pump shutoff system. Now, these are also known as a Stingle, is the brand who usually dominates this category. Realistically, Stingles don't work that well. Anybody who's out there working on a Stingle will understand that if a bird casts its shadow over your main drain at the bottom of that pool and it's got a Stingle installed, that shadow is going to cause that sucker to shut off. Or if there's two leaves on top of there. They're overly sensitive when it comes to all of the suction anti-entrapment elements that they provide. And as a result, pretty much every time you get back to your property, it's going to have shut down your system. So again, like I said, the best one is the SVRS system when it comes to mitigation. But again, like I said, all of these mitigate. They do not eliminate. In fact, according to the Association of Pool and Spa Professionals, according to the National Swimming Pool Foundation, to the federal government, and us at Pool Training Academy, the only way to eliminate main drain entrapment is to disable your main drain. That's right, to cut it off, cap it off, and never use it again. Now, this is the part in the presentation where everybody's like, this guy's a madman, forget it, his credibility's lost. Now, hear me out on this, because it's not as crazy as it sounds. In fact, there's actually an Association of Pool and Spa Professionals scientific study that backs up exactly what I'm talking about here. If you want to go online and search for that study, you can find it, and it will confirm everything that I'm speaking about here. Realistically, we need to first ask ourselves, what is our main drain good for? Well, a lot of people will say, well, you need it to clean. Well, has anybody ever tried to brush debris down into their main drain to clean it? The way that this works is you get that brush head on the pole, you push that down on the bottom of the pool, it kicks up that dirt into a giant pluming cloud, and then it takes about 8 minutes for it to fall back down onto the ground, and then you brush it again, and it does the same process. So if you want to waste 9 hours of your day, clean your pool by brushing that debris down into the main drain. Instead, I recommend you vacuum through one of your skimmers, and you'll get that pool cleaned up in about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on its size. So the cleaning argument is kind of out the window. The next argument is, well, what about for circulation? Now, circulation, as you can see, if you look at our Colorado State Pool Code, and if you look at the majority of the other state codes out there, you're going to see that they built inside the code that if a pool is built up to code, it's required to be able to pull 100% of suction from the surface, i.e. the skimmers. So that means that I can pull 100% of my circulation through my skimmers and achieve 100% of my required flow, and as a result, hit my turnover rates with no problem. So with circulation, I can cut that off and never have any problems. Now, there's a lot of people who are like, well, what about the ratios? What about the ratios? Don't you need circulation at the bottom of the pool and the top of the pool? Well, let's go ahead and turn over to page 123 in our books. On page 123, we're going to go back into that water circulation chapter, and we're going to see towards the bottom there on the right-hand corner, it's going to say that, the left-hand corner, it's going to say the commonly accepted practice is that 75% of the water return to your facility from the surface with 25 from the main drain. So that means that I'm not diverting a huge amount of suction up to my surface. In fact, I'm only diverting 25% up there. Like I said, I've been citing this Association of Pool and Spa Professionals scientific study, and in fact, in that study, they say that the main drain is virtually useless. There is no good reason why we have that main drain on there. In fact, the only reason they can find in this study is that it exists there for tradition's sake. You're seeing a lot of our newer builds being built without a main drain. Now, at your property, if you want to become compliant with this, unfortunately, you can't just shut off that main drain valve at the inside of your pump room. Instead, you're going to have to hacksaw through the line and cap that off. If you do this, you will never have to worry about main drain entrapment again. Now, some might say, well, Alex, if I do that, then I'll never be able to drain my pool again because that's what the main drain is for. Well, instead, just go down to Home Depot, grab a sump pump, throw that inside the pool, and you'll drain it twice as fast as if you were draining with, or instead of draining with your main drain like that. So again, like I said, it is virtually unnecessary. I should say virtually is not even the right word. It's completely unnecessary to have a main drain inside of your pools and your spas. Because the other thing, the last thing that I'm going to throw out there about this on my soapbox in this situation is we take into consideration 2 kids swimming in a lazy river in the summer of 2018. These 2 kids were able to get their fingers under that main drain cover and pop it off. So now their VGB mitigation is completely gone. One of these kids gets sucked to the bottom of this pool, but thankfully there was a former retired Marine walking by the side of the pool and saw these kids struggling at the bottom of the pool. He jumped in and was able to give that kid who was sucked to the pool CPR underwater and kept him alive for 9 minutes. 9 minutes. If it wasn't for that guy, that kid would have been dead at the bottom of that pool. And again, this is why I say with drain disablement, you would never see that, because even if that kid was able to pop that cover off, he would never be introduced to suction in the first place. So, like I said, at your properties, I'm not meaning to scare you guys with this information. I'm meaning to educate you and say that that drain disablement is a great option. The best way you can test this is go back to your facility, use that valve that's installed on your main drain line, and shut the main drain off. Then go over to your flow meter and see that it doesn't move at all. If it doesn't move at all, you are the perfect candidate for drain disablement. If it does move, then that means unfortunately you weren't built to code. So you are going to be required to follow one of the other VGB mitigation requirements in this section. Now, some of you may still not be convinced, being like, I don't buy what Alex is talking about. That's totally up to you. I don't want you to do anything that you're uncomfortable with, just as long as you make sure that you are keeping those drains as protected as possible by following every step that we've talked about in this VGB section so far. Now, another thing to remember with this is our covers. With our anti-entrapment drain covers, as long as you're buying these from a reputable pool source, you should be just fine. But one of the big things that you want to look for when it comes to the labeling on there is that flow rate. That flow rate needs to match your actual operating flow rate on your pool or your hot tub. Another thing to remember is the lifespan, or it will tell you the number of years. Usually it tells you 3, 5, 7, or 9, depending on which one you purchase. Now with this, it's really crucial to understand that this code is a living code and it changes all the time. So one of the big changes that just came in November of 2018 is it says that if you do not keep basically the birth certificate of that main drain cover when it's shipped to you, if you don't keep that certificate that it came with, you no longer have a compliant main drain, even if that main drain is 3 weeks old. So I highly recommend that you hold on to that paperwork and make sure that you keep it somewhere inside your pump room if you're ever asked for it. Now, when it comes to installing those covers, make sure that you're not using any old components or holes. We don't want people to be able to get their fingers underneath there and pop that sucker off. We want it to be tight. Also, make sure that you are using, as part of your opening and closing duties, make sure that somebody's grabbing a pool pole, putting a brush head on there, and pushing up against that main drain cover, and that it's not wiggling anywhere. As long as it's secured in place, you should be good to go. Now, again, make sure that we're testing all of our facilities and all of our systems. I highly recommend that you review the website, poolsafely.gov, every single month or every couple of months if you can. Unfortunately, whenever there's an update to the law, they don't send this out to us, even if we're subscribed to the newsletter. So we need to go and be proactive and be checking that poolsafely.gov website for any updates to our VGB codes. Now, if you do have a secondary anti-entrapment device, make sure that you're testing that system weekly. Go ahead and grab a towel, throw it into the water, push it all the way down to the bottom of that pool, and cover up that main drain. After a couple of seconds, it should kick on that secondary anti-entrapment device, shut your system down, and if it does, you're good to go. If it doesn't, then simply make sure that your system gets the service that's required to make sure that that system works. Now, if you have any questions about this section, be sure to write them down now so we can answer them during the Q&A section. All right, so now let's move on to skimmers. On to our skimmers. So after covering our main drain, there's a second place where our water leaves the swimming pool, and that's through the skimmers on the side of the pool. Now, there's a couple of different skimmer types out there. First, there is the gutter type. Now, the gutter type skimmer works on the principle of surface tension removal. So essentially what this looks like is essentially a gutter like on the side of your house. And if you keep your water about 1/4 of an inch above the lip on that gutter, the water will just slowly splash over the side of the gutter, run down the gutter, and into a large surge or holding tank. And in that surge or holding tank, that's where the actual circulation begins. As you can see on this slide, the pool is on the left side there, main drain is at the bottom, and the gutters are at the top. The water runs down the gutter, goes into the surge tank, and then over on the right side, you've got a funky looking picture of a pump and motor. So as we can see here, there's no direct suction inside of a guttered system like this. But like I said, beware, because there are certain systems out there that I've seen personally where the main drain is actually tied directly in to the pump and motor itself. So in order to keep VGB compliant, make sure that you're checking that main drain. Now, the next one that we're going to be talking about here is a little bit more common. This one probably makes a little bit more sense and looks a little bit more familiar to all of you, which is our wall-mounted skimmers. Our wall-mounted skimmers. Now, these are those box-like openings in the wall itself. Each one of these is rated for a flow of 55 gallons per minute per skimmer. That's just good to know information, not necessarily need to know information. The majority of our codes out there require that you have at least one skimmer for every 400 square feet of surface area on your swimming pool, and they require that you have a minimum of 2 skimmers on every facility. And this varies by code, but those are the bare minimums that we find across the majority of our codes. Now, that goes to all of our pool builders out there. For those of us who are just operating on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't necessarily matter that much. Now, a couple of things that you're going to see is on the slide itself, there's a marking that says the floating weir door. Now, that floating weir is a little flappy door, and our goal is to keep our water level about halfway between the tiles of our swimming pools. That way, that water can flow inside of the skimmer itself and run past the weir door. Now, the weir door then moves with the surface of the water. It pulls water in, and then as that water comes over the top of the lip on that weir, it draws the water behind it with the principle of surface tension. So our weir door is the device that is literally drawing our water into our skimmers. Without that weir door, it's going to be a lot more difficult for our surface water to be pulled into our skimmers. Now, the interesting thing is, About 1% of us actually have this weir door installed on our system. The majority of us, after about 4 seconds of the pool being open, this is the first thing that disappears for some reason, and I have no idea where they go. But believe it or not, in states like Colorado here, the floating weir door is actually required by code. And for those of us who are cleaning the pools, again, remember, after a windy day, all those leaves blow into the pool, land on the surface, and if you don't have your weir door, those leaves are not going to get collected into the skimmers themselves. So make sure you get those weir doors installed, and I guarantee you that on those really blustery days like that, you're going to save about 20-25 minutes of skimming simply by having this weir door installed. Now you'll see towards the bottom there, the equalizer line. Now the equalizer line, in theory, is supposed to draw water into our skimmers if our water level goes below the skimmer opening at the surface. To be completely honest, these things simply don't work. And in the newer code after 2017, you'll notice that on our national code or our international code standards, the equalizer line is no longer there. So again, like I said, they are not necessarily a helpful addition. And one of the big things to remember is, as you can see on the slide itself there, the equalizer line needs to be covered because you can have something called passive entrapment occur. And with that equalizer line, if it's open like that, a kid or somebody could swim by and actually lodge their fist inside of that line, and as a result, get their hands stuck in there, not because of suction, but because it's just a hole and they've got their hands lodged inside there and can't get it out. So, according to VGB or Virginia Graham-Baker's Pool and Spa Safety Act requirements, we are required to get that covered up. Now, you'll notice at the bottom there of my list, it says 75% of water should return from the surface. Now, if I were you, in my notes section, I would write that down exactly as it's written on my slide. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because you'll look over on page 123 of your book, and we referenced this a little bit earlier, and you'll see that it says there that the recommended standard practice is that 75% of the water should return from the surface back into your circulation system. Other codes have a 50-50 split, and some codes have no requirements at all. Now, the interesting thing that you're going to find when you get to the exam on this is there's 4 options because it is a multiple choice exam. With that multiple choice, one of your choices is going to be a 75% returning from the surface, but then there's also going to be a 50-50 split option. Now, if we think about this logically, either one of those is allowable according to the book. But unfortunately, according to the test, only the 75% of water should return from the surface is the correct answer. So make sure that you're writing this down so you don't get tricked up once that one comes along. Now, with our skimmer covers, believe it or not, these are required by code to be screwed down into the housing. Don't shoot the messenger on that. Again, I understand that this is going to give you a lot more work that you're going to have to deal with, but it is required by code. Now, thankfully, these come with little fasteners that aren't very long. They're pretty shallow, so it only takes a couple of screws of the screwdriver to pull those off. But what we want to think about is if you look at that one on the right side of the screen there, you're going to see, if you put your 8-year-old eyeballs in and look at that, what is an 8-year-old going to see? They're going to see a Frisbee. And a lot of our kids are not bringing pool toys into the facility. Instead, they're making them up on the spot. They look at that and they see a toy, so they're like, okay, yeah, well, let's go play with this. So they start tossing around. One of them has really bad aim, throws it off to the side of the pool, smacks old Miss Jenkins in the face, and breaks her nose. And according to the local slimeball lawyer, whose fault is that? Well, it's not the kid's fault because he doesn't have any money. Instead, it is our fault as operators, according to a lawsuit like that. So make sure that we screw these down. Now, another thing to think about with this, and I never thought this could happen until humans did it, is a couple of years ago, there was a 2-year-old kid who was playing by the side of the pool, popped this skimmer cover off, and jump down into the skimmer itself. Now, if we think about it, realistically, there's not necessarily any safety hazard going on, but this kid was a little butterball, and he actually got himself lodged inside of the skimmer itself. They tried to butter him up, Crisco him up, put lard around him to try to pop him out, but he was wedged so tightly that they eventually had to jackhammer him out of the hole, i.e., excavate this kid out of the hole. You don't want to be the property that's requiring people to excavate children out of your skimmers. So I highly recommend that you get those suckers screwed down and avoid any potential issues like this. Now, the skimmer baskets inside of your skimmers are our first line of filtration. So one of the big things that I want you to think about is these take a beating over time when we clean them out. And so they're going to get cracks, they're going to get breaks, they're going to get compromised in many different ways. I highly recommend that you make sure you're replacing these as quickly as possible because we don't want any large debris getting down into our circulation system if our skimmers are broken like this. So replace those baskets as often as you can. Now, real quick before we move forward about something else with the skimmers, we do have our equalizer line cover examples here. This is what they're going to look like. Again, like I said, these are required on our skimmers, so make sure that you've got those on those equalizer lines. Now, jumping back over to our skimmers, remember, never put chlorine dabs directly into the skimmer basket itself. Remember the sequence of events that we talked about at the very beginning, and our disinfectant or our chemical supply comes at the very end of the line, and there's a reason for that. Like we had talked about, if you're putting all that sensitive chemical through the lines, you're going to be damaging your system very quickly. Now think about us doing that at the very beginning of this sequence. If we put those those chlorine tabs directly into the skimmers like that, they're going to run that hyperchlorinated water down through all of your sensitive components and destroy them pretty darn quickly. So let's avoid that at all costs. We also want to make sure that we're avoiding it for liability's sake because we don't want anybody accidentally reaching inside of our skimmers, grabbing one of those, looking at it, taking a lick or, heaven forbid, a bite out of it, and suffering the consequences as a result. Now, when it comes to vacuuming, we generally show a video on here. I'm going to skip over this video, and if you want to find it, you can actually go over to our link on the website, pooltrainingacademy.com, and watch our tips on how to vacuum your facility. So this might make a little noise jump, so don't worry. That got you excited about it, didn't it? You're definitely going to want to go check it out. All right, so with our piping, once our water leaves through the main drain or the skimmer, the first thing that's going to hit is a bunch of PVC piping all over our systems. Like I said, sometimes those pipes can be really, really confusing. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're color coding that. Now, there is a color code example in the book, but believe it or not, I recommend that you don't use that. Instead, go over to our website at pooltrainingacademy.com, go to the Codes and Resources page, and right there you will see all of the links to your local codes if they are available. Now again, all you're going to need for this is just a couple of cans of spray paint, some directional stickers, and a couple of hours worth of work. It's fairly straightforward, fairly easy. Now, the first component that our water hits when it gets into our systems is the pump and motor. The pump and the motor. Now, with this pump and motor, the first thing that we're going to experience, or the water's going to hit, is our lint pot. Our lint pot has a basket inside of it, and this is our last line of defense for large debris going inside of our sensitive circulation component called our impeller. I highly recommend that you open that lid on your pump and clean this basket out on a fairly regular basis. Every once in a while, you will have to replace it, but that just kind of comes with the territory. Now, with that impeller itself, think about this as the heart of your system. The impeller creates the centrifugal force to move the water. Now, these used to be made out of giant pieces of brass, but over time, they've been modified and enhanced and turned into a plastic component. you're going to see the impeller as that flat circular disc piece on this image here. Now, what it does on the front side is it sucks water in. It draws it in, creates a vacuum, spins it around the disc, and shoots it up out of the top of the motor. And this is how our circulation exists inside of our facilities. Now, as you can see here, we've got a real-world photo of our impeller. Now, one of the big things that I want you to notice is you see that black disc in there, and then if you follow that over to the right, that's where it connects itself into the motor housing itself. You're going to see a little silver component that connects that black impeller to the motor itself. Now, it's important for us to keep that in mind because we're going to be talking about something called cavitation here. Now, when our water pressure drops, or if we've got bubbles in the line from a break or something like that, or we're sucking air from somewhere, those bubbles or that air is going to make its way down into your circulation system. And right before it gets to that impeller, these bubbles are going to start making these little, what we call microbursts or micro explosions. And those little micro explosions rock that impeller back and forth on that metal component that connects the impeller to the motor itself. Now, the reason why this is important is because when this cavitation occurs that causes that rocking back and forth, it can over time cause that metal component to warp, which will then give you an uneven spin on that circular impeller. Over time, it's going to warp so much that it will actually end up destroying the entire pump casing. So what I recommend is, one, make sure you don't have any water or air leaking into your system. You want only water running down in there. And if you hear an uneven sound or a sloshing sound going on inside of your motor and your pump when you get into your pump room, make sure you shut that system down and detect exactly where that issue is coming from, because you want to stop it before it gets too far. Because unfortunately, you cannot replace that metal component that connects the impeller to the motor. You just have to replace the entire motor, which is a really, really big bummer. So we're looking to watch out for cavitation. Now, with our motors themselves, one of the big things that we got to think about is this is basically the power source for the heart of the system. These are very, they come in a bunch of different varieties. They come in a bunch of different colors, shapes, speeds, and sizes. Now, one of the big things to remember with our motors, that as of 2021, these are required. All of our motors across the U.S. are required to be turned into what's called a variable speed motor. Now, variable speed, there's 3 different types of motors, and I'll go over those really quickly. I don't want to get too in the weeds on this because I don't want to confuse you too much. But the first one is a single speed. The second one is a dual speed. And the third is a variable speed. Now, think about it in the same way as we have our cars. If my car only had one gear, I would be reversing out of my driveway at 75 miles per hour and then driving down my street at 75 miles per hour and getting onto the highway at 75 miles per hour. Not safe and definitely not great for gas mileage. Now let's look at dual speed. With a dual speed motor, I'm backing out of my driveway at about 5 miles an hour. Then I'm driving down my street at 5 miles an hour. And then I jump on the highway at 75 miles an hour. Again, not ideal, a little bit better than the single speed, but with variable speed, I can adjust that motor to the speed that I need exactly. And so as a result, I'm going to draw less amperage, which means I'm going to lower my energy bill in the long run. And that's the reason why they're going for these variable speed motors like this, is to lower our energy costs in the long run. Now, one of the big things that I also want you to do when you get back to your property is make sure that you're taking a photo of the ID tag on that motor itself. This ID tag is really important. The reason why it's important is because when you need to replace that motor, this is the information that you're going to need to give to that pool supplier in order for them to give you the right size motor. The big things that you want to take note of is the voltage on that, the horsepower, the phase, whether it's a 1 or 3 phase motor, and the frame size. So again, that's the voltage, the horsepower, the phase, and the frame size. Like I said, in my opinion, it's worth taking a photo of so you don't have to lodge that somewhere inside of your memory. Instead, you've just got it on your camera roll when you need to access that information. Now let's talk really quickly about total dynamic head, or TDH, as we call it. Now, anybody who's in plumbing, TDH, or total dynamic head, is a very common phrase out there. But for those of us who are not super familiar with it, think of it in a basic way that this is a measurement of the amount of water resistance that's running through your system. Now, the reason why we need to understand this measurement is to size our pumps properly. We need to know how much resistance is going through that system because for that reason, it allows us to buy a pump that's going to be able to pull that water through that system around all those 90-degree elbows or whatever kind of plumbing may be in the way. So this calculation is actually going to be found in your book, depending on which one it's going to be, either page 128 or 129. Now, for some reason, my slide is being goofy here, so I apologize about that. I don't know what's going on, but what you're going to want to do is make sure you write this one down. Make sure you write this piece of information down because it's going to help you on the test itself. What we're going to do is we're going to install an oil-filled vacuum gauge before the pump. An oil-filled vacuum gauge before the pump. I know on the slide it just says BFA, but it's actually before. So again, the oil-filled vacuum gauge, the vacuum gauge goes before the pump. The way that it's easy to remember this is there's vacuum on the front side of that pump, so it's suction, vacuum. Next, you're going to install an oil-filled pressure gauge immediately after the pump. Oil-filled pressure gauge after the pump. There's vacuum on the front side, pressure on the top side. Now, I will say there's also some math involved that you'll find depending on the edition of your book on page 128 or 129. Don't worry about that math, my friends. Take a note of it if you ever need to calculate your total dynamic head, but I'm not going to give you math information that's not on the test itself. And this is one of those that's not on the test itself, so I don't want to be clouding your brains with a bunch of information only to have some of it not be on the test. So like I said, reference page 128 or 129, depending on your edition of the book, and if you need that math, you'll find it exactly right there. Now we see some examples here. Before the pump right there, that is our vacuum gauge. Right after the pump is our pressure gauge. When we say immediately, we mean immediately. Now, before we wrap this chapter up, let's talk about some meters, valves, and gauges that you're going to interact with. Now, as we can see here, these are our flow meters. Remember, we talked about those flow meters a little bit earlier in the chapter. The one on the left there is our old school one, the one that we see across the country in the majority of our pump rooms. These work, but believe it or not, according to spec, these are required to be installed on 6 feet of straight pipe in order to be accurate, or as accurate as possible. Now, let's be real. How many of us have 6 feet of straight pipe inside of our systems? The majority of us are lucky to have 1 foot of straight pipe to install on these, let alone 6. So as a result, we're getting very inaccurate numbers off of these old school flow meters. Now, another thing that you'll see is sometimes you'll shut your system off and miraculously your flow meter is still reading at 140 gallons per minute or whatever it may be at. The reason why this happens is because you get a bunch of calcium buildup inside of that old school flow meter and it sticks that float or that bullet inside there in one spot. So then you got to uninstall it from the line, pour something slightly or mildly acidic like vinegar down inside there, shake it around, clean it out, reinstall it, and start the system up. This is obnoxious. So instead, I recommend you take a look over to the right of the screen there and look at that new school guy. Now, this is called the FlowViz by a company called H2 Flow. This is known as an inline flow meter. Now, the way these work is the water flows through the front of the pipe there, and as you can see, there's that little red section, that's a little tongue that sticks down inside the pipe. Water flows through, pulls that tongue down, and reads at a 98.2, I believe, percent accuracy level on that FlowViz system. Incredibly accurate. The thing that's also really nice about these is you can install them on 1 foot of pipe. You can install them on 20 feet of straight pipe. You can install them on a slope. You can install them vertically. You can install them upside down. Wherever you install these in your system, they are still going to give you that 98% accurate read. They are incredible. Now, if you look at the price difference between these two, the old school one's only going to be about $30 cheaper than the FlowViz. So I highly recommend that you look into H2 Flow and what they have to offer for your system. Make sure that you're installing these in such a way that they are able to read 1.5 to 1.5 times the minimum required flow rate. A lot of times we'll walk into a pump room when doing an inspection and we'll notice that the flow rate has maxed out at 150 gallons per minute when their minimum flow requirement is 225 gallons per minute. Unfortunately, we have no idea how to read the accuracy of that because it's maxed out that flow meter. So make sure that you've got some space above, some room to breathe on that flow meter. Also, make sure that you're installing this after the heater. We want to make sure that we're installing it after the heater so it gives us the most accurate read on our flow through our system. If you were to install it somewhere closer or in between one of the components, it's going to either speed the water up or slow the water down, depending on where you're at. And as a result, it might throw off your flow reading there. So make sure that you're installing that after the entire system on the pipe going back out to your pool. Now with our valves, we have a wide plethora of valve options out there. Now, the one that I want us to point out is on that top right corner there, the black Jandy valve. The big thing to remember with this black Jandy handle like this is when the handle is running parallel with the pipe like it is in that photo, that pipe is closed. When it's running perpendicular with the pipe, that line is open. This goes completely counter with what we're always used to. And these Jandy valves are one of the most popular and most commonly used valves out there. So if you're new to pools and spas, make sure you're checking to see if you have those Jandy valves because you'll know that they're backwards. Pretty much any valve you want to use out there is within code unless it's a brass-handled valve. If you have a brass-handled valve inside of your pump room, take a photo and send it to a museum because those have not been code for over 60 years. So I guarantee that nobody's going to have those brass valves, but if you do, make sure you get them changed out with something PVC as quickly as possible. And with that, again, make sure that you write down any of your questions that you may have had in this section so we can address it during the Q&A session. Chapter 11, Pool and Spa Filtration. Chapter 11. Go ahead and turn over to Chapter 11 inside of your books. Now, as we can see on our sequence, we are running through filtration right now. Now, with filtration, it is the process of removing soluble matter from the water, so getting all the gross stuff out of our water so it stays as clean and healthy as possible. This filtration directly is going to affect the clarity of the water. It's going to be removing those particles that cause any sort of clouding, any sort of issues inside of our water. So really, filtration is both a health and safety concern as well as an aesthetic concern as well. Now, the way that we filter our water is by pushing it through various filter media. Now, filter media is the substance used to capture the matter, thus removing it from the water. There's a few different options that we have, and we're going to be talking about those later on in the chapter. But we just need to remember that all of our filters are working with some sort of media. Now, what we're looking for with this media is to capture the lowest microbic level possible. As you can see, the chart on the slide adheres to the same one in your books, and we'll see that this is a good reference. Over there on the left side, we're going to see that a single grain of table salt weighs in at a whopping 100 microns. A single grain of table salt. On the far right, in contrast of that, one bacterium weighs in at 1 micron in size. 1 micron equals out to be 1/25,000th of an inch. So as we can see, our limit of visibility ends at about 40 microns. There's only one of our sand filters that won't filter down past the microscopic level, and that is rapid rate sand filters. All of our other sand filters will filter down below that microscopic level. Now, one thing that we also need to talk about is our filter media rate. Our filter media rate is the rate of the flow of water through a given filter media. Now, as we can see here on the slide, we need to remember that, as I said, we have a bunch of different options when it comes to media. One of the big things to think about with this is if I'm pushing water through something like sand, it only makes sense that that sand is going to slow the flow of that water. It's going to cause some sort of restriction. These numbers over here, the filter media rates, are going to show you what that speed of the water moving through each one of these filter medias is per square foot. So if I have high rate sand, according to our slide here, which is commercially rated, you're going to see that it's between 12 and 20 gallons per minute for every square foot. Now let's put this into context. Remember our 33,000 gallon our 33,000 gallon pool required that we have 92 gallons per minute of flow through that system. Now, if my high rate sand filter is only able to push, let's say, 12 gallons per minute through its square foot of space, is that going to cut it? Absolutely not. So we need to have multiple square feet of sand in order to get our flow up to that 92 gallons per minute. And this is where we talk about our filter sizing calculation. This is where that information comes into play. So go ahead and in your workbook, the little flimsy guy, go ahead and open up to page 2. Page 2 in your flimsy workbook. And towards the bottom there, you're going to see the filter sizing section. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use our system's minimum flow rate that we use to calculate, or figured out, to calculate our filter's minimum filter area. The reason why we want to do this is because that's going to let us know that even at the lowest baseline, our filtration equipment will still be robust enough for our systems to flow correctly. So on that page 2, at the bottom there, you're going to see our filter sizing calculation. And that filter sizing calculation is flow rate, or our minimum flow rate, divided by our filter media rate that we're given. And that's going to show us how many square feet of that sand media, or whatever media you're using, is required. So let's read this question together and do the math together as well. Our example says that the flow rate of our 120,000 gallon pool is at 333 gallons per minute. Our filter media rate of choice is high rate sand at 12 gallons per minute per square foot. What is your required filter area? We have all of the information that we need right there inside of the question itself. Now let's just plug it in and push it out. Our flow rate is 333 gallons. Our filter media rate, according to this question, is 12 gallons per minute. So let's simply take 333 divided by 12. And what do you get? If you got 27.75, that is correct. We're looking at roughly 28 square feet of filtration area. Again, with this math, if you didn't get it correct the first time, I highly recommend that you rewind the video, listen again, look at the math on page 2, make sure that it really sinks in and makes sense for you, because you will be asked one of these questions on the exam itself. Now that we've figured out how to properly size our filters, let's next talk about the different types of filters. The first type we're going to talk about is sand filters. Now, there are 2 different variations of our sand filters. The first one is going to be our high-rate sand filters. Now, our high-rate sand filters are filled with high-grade silica sand, aka really glorified fiberglass. This stuff is really good at filtration. As you can see, it will filter down to 25 microns. That's really good. That's below human visibility. But here's what I'll say, is I want to talk a little bit in depth on this when it comes to filtration. One of the biggest things that we're worried about inside of the pool industry is making sure that we prevent a recreational water illness called cryptosporidium. Now, our cryptosporidium is a little parasite, and given enough of those parasites inside of somebody, it can make them extremely sick. Believe it or not, this is the number one, the most common recreational water illness. And unfortunately, it is our deadliest recreational water illness because of the symptoms that it causes. Severe diarrhea and vomiting can lead to severe dehydration, which then leads to hospitalization. And in the very young, the very old, and the immune compromised, we can see death occurring because of this. So we don't want cryptosporidium in our water. So let's get it out of there. One of the options that we have is to chlorinate it. Well, theoretically, one of the options that we have is to chlorinate it. But let's go ahead and look at the science here. Turn quickly to page 41 in your handbooks. Page 41 in your handbooks. Now there's going to be a germ inactivation chart there. That germ inactivation chart is going to show you how quickly a given recreational water illness is killed off in 1 part per million of chlorine. So let's go ahead and look at cryptosporidium. How long does it take to kill off cryptosporidium in 1 part per million of chlorine? You read that correctly. That is 10.6 days. Not hours, not minutes, days. This stuff is highly chlorine resistant. So in 2015, there was a Cornell study that was conducted on getting rid of cryptosporidium out of your water. In this study, they cited that, believe it or not, as their study goes, the evidence was inconclusive that chlorine would actually even kill cryptosporidium at all. So in certain ways, that's a little bit alarming, knowing that that cryptosporidium could potentially live indefinitely inside of our water. But they also gave us good news. They said that the good news is we can filter cryptosporidium out. It can get captured inside of our filter media. They then went on to tell us that cryptosporidia weigh in each at about 4 to 6 microns in size. Well, the majority of us are working with these high-rate sand filters that we're looking at on the slide here. And as we just talked about, these will only filter down to 25 microns. Now here's the problem. That 4 to 6 micron cryptosporidia swimming through a 25 micron filter like silica sand is the same equivalent as a 5-foot tall person swimming through an 80-foot chasm. Unfortunately, that cryptosporidium is going to blast right through your high-grade silica sand. So I've given you 2 pieces of bad news. Let me give you the good happy ending here. The happy ending is that we have a product out there that's called C-Clear, SEAKLEAR, C-Clear, and it's the PRS. PRS stands for Particulate Removal System. Now, with the particulate removal system, it's what's called a flocculant. It's a very strange sounding word, but what a flocculant does, now this isn't necessarily the scientific explanation, I'm just giving you a word picture that helps you understand this concept a little bit more, but what a flocculant does is it takes individual contaminants and causes them to magnetize together and clump up or create larger compounds. Then those compounds are large enough to get lodged inside of our high-rate sand filters, and then we can filter that out through a backwash. So effectively, if I have a 25 micron sand filter and I use the C-Clear PRS, I have taken my 25 micron filter and actually enhanced it down to a 0.5 micron filter. That's right, C-Clear PRS is guaranteed to flocculate down to a 0.5 micron level. That's pretty impressive. The thing that's really nice is C-Clear PRS is very inexpensive. So you can be adding this on a regular basis in order to get any sort of potential cryptosporidium that may have snuck inside your pool filtered out as easy as possible. So again, like I said, I highly recommend that all of us operators are using C-Clear PRS. Now, another thing to keep in mind is you'll see here that it says these filters are generally single gauged. If I were you, I would write down that a high rate sand filter has 1 gauge. A high rate sand filter has 1 gauge. Now, this gauge is going to essentially show us the health or the life of our filters themselves. Over time, our filters are going to start compacting with a bunch of gross stuff. And as a result, it's going to start to raise that filter pressure. As that filter pressure raises, the sand filter itself starts to clean a lot less. Now, what we're looking at is we want to see a raise at 8 to 10 psi over start. Now, the starting pressure is either what you started that filter out brand new or after a fresh backwash or cleaning of that filter. When that starting pressure raises 8 to 10 psi over start, we know that we need to re-backwash. We need to clean that filter out. So really quickly, turn over to page 144 in your books. Page 144. And in the top left corner there, you're going to see a photo of the inner workings of a high-rate sand filter. The way that a high-rate sand filter works regularly is the water comes through that top pipe on the outside of the filter, runs through those top stand pipes, pushes that water down through the sand bed that's usually inside of that photo or inside the filter itself, and then it pushes it out through what's called those manifold lateral underdrains, or in our industry, we call them just simply laterals. This is the way our high-rate sand filters work in general. Now, again, like I said, when it runs 8 to 10 psi over starting pressure, we need to clean that filter with a backwash. What a backwash does is it takes the water and reverses the flow. Instead of going through the top pipe, it pushes it down through the bottom pipe, pushes all of the water up through the bottom of the sand bed, churns it up, knocks it around, and then washes that out by pushing all that dirty debris out through the top pipe and down through the waistline. This is a backwash. Now, how long do we do this process for? Well, we backwash simply until the sight glass is clear. There is a sight glass that will be installed on your system, and if you don't have one installed on your system, make sure that you get one installed on your system because they are required by code and they are extremely helpful, especially because we no longer have to go off of we backwash here every 3 days and we do it for 5 minutes sort of mentality. Instead, we now have a scientific understanding of how we do this. We backwash when that pressure gauge goes 8 to 10 psi over start, and we backwash simply until that sight glass goes clear. Once it goes clear, you can go back into regular filter mode and you're good to go. Now, one of the big things that I will say is make sure that you're backwashing and degreasing once a month. Degrease once a month and backwash whenever you need to, whenever you see that 8 to 10 psi. Because if you don't, what's going to happen over time? Let's just say it's completely against my principles to backwash. I think it's a bad idea. Well, what's going to happen to my filter? Over time, I'm going to basically create a giant ball inside of that filter itself. That sand is going to compact in on itself. The grease is going to glue that sand together. And instead of my water going through the sand bed, instead it's going to run on the outside of the sand bed. This is called channeling. Now, if I were you, I would write down that channeling equals unfiltered water back to the pool. Channeling equals unfiltered water back to the pool. We don't want unfiltered water going back into our pools. So this is why we need to make sure that we're backwashing and degreasing regularly. Now, finally, we're going to talk about our broken lateral issues. Again, over on page 144 at the top left corner there, you're going to see our laterals. This is our last line of defense from sand getting back into our pools. Well, over time, these can, since they are under pressure, break and crack and spit sand back out into your pool or into your hot tub. If this situation happens, it's time to replace those laterals. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take that lid off the top, scoop all the way down to the bottom of that filter, making sure that you're wearing a respirator and wearing long sleeves. Because remember, high-grade silica sand is carcinogenic. We don't want to be breathing that in. So make sure that you're wearing a mask. Make sure that you're wearing long sleeves because you don't want that fiberglass ripping up your arms. Dig all the way down and replace all the laterals inside of your filter. Now, the reason why I recommend that you replace all of them at once is because we don't know which one of those is broken necessarily, because some of them can have a really hairline cracks that only reveal themselves once they're under pressure. So I, as a result, recommend that you just you just replace all of those laterals all at once. Once you're done replacing them, you're going to fill that filter about halfway up with water and then start slowly pouring the bags of sand inside of that filter. Make sure that you're not dumping it down in there, because if you dump it down in there, it's going to land on those laterals and it could break those laterals and end you back up at square one again. So make sure that you are pouring very, very carefully and very slowly at first until you have a really good bed of sand. Then you can pour a little bit more generously, but I never recommend that you dump it in there. Now, one of the last things that we are going to talk about in here, even though I said the laterals was the last thing, when it comes to sand replacement, it's recommended that you replace your sand probably every 3 to 7 years. If you are backwashing and degreasing regularly, you're going to be able to get to that 7-year mark. If you're not treating your sand very well, it's probably going to be closer to that 3-year mark. So make sure you're replacing that sand on a fairly regular basis, because you don't want to be dealing with dirty sand inside of your filters. Now, with our rapid rate sand filters, one of the big differences is we're using coarse sand and gravel inside our rapid rate sand filters. Another thing that you're going to see is size difference. The average adult male is going to be able to stand up inside of one of these filters and not hit their head on the top of it. They're also going to be able to reach their arms out to the sides and not be able to touch the walls of these filters. They are gigantic. And you'll also notice on the front of the filter that we see in the slide here is that they have both an influent and effluent gauge. Those influent and effluent gauges also give us insight into when we need to backwash. When those influent and effluent gauges have a difference of 10 to 20 psi over starting pressure between those gauges, that's when you know it's time to backwash. 10 to 20 psi over starting pressure between the two gauges is when you backwash a rapid rate sand filter. Now, if we'll look here, we'll see that this filter only has a 50 micron filter power. So make sure that you are using C-Clear PRS on your rapid rate sand filters in order to keep your swimmers as safe and healthy as possible. Since these are sand, you still have the same risks of channeling. They still need to backwash and degrease regularly, and need to be watching out for those broken laterals all the way through. Remember, when you're backwash until the sight glass is clear, and you're good to go. Now, if you want to watch a backwashing video, again, you will find the link to the backwashing video on our pooltrainingacademy.com website, and you'll be able to get all the video information that you need right there. One of the big things that we talk about in the backwashing section here is our valves that are used to backwash. The first one is our multi-port valve. Now, our multi-port valve is one of the most popular out there. It's a great valve. It works well. I highly recommend that you turn that handle only clockwise. Now, they're designed to be able to turn clockwise or counterclockwise, but unfortunately, there's a design flaw in those that if you turn it counterclockwise, you risk ripping up or balling up the spider gasket that's inside of that multi-port, and then you can get water leaking over from one of the other ports into another port. It gets complicated, it gets messy, so this is why we recommend that you just go clockwise. Now, with the push-pull and the high performance, all of these valves all work well. They're all great. Each one of them is probably going to cause a little bit of different operation in your facility, but realistically, they all get the backwashing job done. Edit this out. Now, cartridge filters. Cartridge filters are going to be our next filter on the list. They've got a filter media rate of 0.375 gallons per minute per square foot. This water is eking out of these cartridges at every square foot. So imagine if I had a pool that needed to run at 92 gallons per minute and I was running at 3.75 gallons per minute per square foot. These filters need to be gigantic to make up for that when it comes to the square footage. But the thing that's really nice about these filters is that they filter down to 15 microns. They are really, really powerful. Now, the biggest sales point on these and the biggest selling idea on these is that they conserve water. If I were you, I would write down that a cartridge filter uses the least amount of water to clean. Again, a cartridge filter uses the least amount of water to clean. The reason why is because we don't backwash these like we do our sand filters. Our cleaning process comes in a little bit of a different way because, as you can see inside of this cutout on this cartridge filter, is we are actually using cartridges. Now, earlier I said we need a huge amount of space in order to make up for that 0.375 gallons per minute. Now, the nice thing is we make up for that space need by a draped design on these cartridges. Think about the cabin air filter inside of your car. It takes up a little bit of space, but if you were to undo it from its a little accordion shape, it would become really long and have a ton of space on there. This is exactly what we're doing with our cartridges. Some of these cartridges can even hold up to 50 pounds of dirt. Now, as you can see, our photo here, it's a little chopped for some reason. When our pressure increases 8 to 10 psi over start, we're going to pull that filter out. There's going to usually be a few of those cartridges inside there. We pull them out, we get them inside some sort of holding tank, like a trash can that's used just for cleaning. We fill it up with water, and then we create a solution that we can get from our local pool supplier, and we soak those cartridges for 2 to 4 days. Now, you want to make sure that you always have a secondary set on hand in order to put back into the regular filtration equipment so you're not having any downtimes because of your cartridge cleaning like this. So after that 2 to 4 days, you're going to pull those cartridges out and make sure that you are just using a garden hose to spray them down, clean them off. Don't use a pressure washer because the fibers on those cartridges are very, very delicate. And as a result, if you use something like a pressure washer, it can break those fibers and cause your filter to go bad. So just wash them by hand using a garden sprayer. Then let them dry, let them air dry, and then once they're air dried, I highly recommend that you grab a trash bag and bag those cartridges up. The reason why you want to bag those cartridges like that is because there's dust particles floating around in our pump rooms. And if these cartridges are just sitting out there, they're going to be gathering all of that dust, and you're going to put those clean cartridges in at a deficit. So bag them up, and you'll have cleaner cartridges when you need to replace those. Once you clean them up, they look like this, and you're good to go again. Now, the last kind of filter we're going to be talking about in this chapter is diatomaceous earth, or DE. Now, a diatomaceous earth filter uses diatoms as its filtration agent. Now, a diatom is essentially in the family of plankton, and it's exoskeleton of an ancient plankton that's been crushed up into a really, really fine powder. Now, one of the big things that's good to know about diatomaceous earth is it is our strongest filter media. And I would write that down, that diatomaceous earth is our most effective filter media. As we can see here on the slide, it will filter down to 4 microns. And if you're remembering correctly, that means it will automatically filter out cryptosporidium. That's great. Diatomaceous earth is great for that. Diatomaceous earth is also great at being highly carcinogenic, so make sure that you're wearing respiration equipment. Make sure you're wearing all of your PPE that's needed in order to stay as safe as possible when working with diatomaceous earth. Now, just like our regular filters, these do need to be backwashed when cleaned. Now, let's take it to the very beginning. Let's say that I've just opened a brand new pool facility and I'm using a DE filter like this. Well, when I start up my system and I'm running my water through that DE system, it's filled with a bunch of screens. And those screens are not doing any filtering because I have not put any diatomaceous earth inside of my system. So what I'm going to do is, as I'm talking about this, I highly recommend that you see at the very bottom of the slide that recoat, pre-coat. Write that down as we're talking about it here. Because essentially what I'm doing is I'm doing the pre-coat on this. That I am going to take a bucket, I'm going to grab some water, I'm going to grab my bag of diatomaceous earth, and I'm going to scoop out 1 to 1.5 pounds for every 10 square feet of surface area I have inside of that DE filter. And I'm going to mix it into that bucket, create a slurry, and I'm going to pour it down the back pipe of my skimmer. And what that's going to do is it's going to run that DE down into my filter, and it's going to coat those screens. It's going to coat those DE screens. Now, once I have a good caking of DE inside of that filter, then I will officially be filtering. It will be capturing all that matter that runs through there. Now, once my pressure increases 8 to 10 psi over start, then I need to clean this just like a sand filter. I need to backwash. That means I'm reversing the flow, and I'm backwashing until sight glass goes clear on there. Now, again, what we're thinking about is when we reverse the flow, that's going to kick off our entire layer of caking of diatomaceous earth that we put on there in the first place. So once I go back into regular filter mode, I'm blowing water through just the regular screens again, which means I need to go back out to the side of the pool and recoat at 1 to 1.5 pounds for every 10 square feet, mix it into a slurry, pour it down, so on and so forth. DE is great, though it can be a little bit of a headache to work with. But again, like I said, the big reason why a lot of people are going for these is because it is our strongest filter media out there at 4 microns. Now again, we've reached the end of this chapter. Make sure that you're writing down any of the questions that you may have in order to ask during the Q&A session. Chapter 12, Heating and Air Circulation. Chapter 12. We've already gone through the pump and motor, the filter, and now our water is running through our heating system. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about in this chapter is our energy or heat loss. There are 4 different ways that we lose our heat from our facilities. The first way is going to be through evaporation. One thing that I want you guys to remember when you are doing the test is low humidity equals high evaporation. High humidity equals low evaporation. They are opposites of one another. So in this situation, up to 50% of our heat loss can come from this evaporative heat loss. Now, it's good to remember that if you keep your air humidity between 40 and 60%, you're going to lower that evaporative heat loss. But unfortunately, if you're outdoors and you're in a really dry climate like here in Colorado, you're only going to see about 13 to 25% humidity on certain days. And so as a result, that evaporative heat loss is just going to kind of come with the territory. Now, next we have convection heat loss. Think about when you get a cup of coffee. If you blow across the surface, it cools that coffee off. Same thing is going to happen with your swimming pools. Air or wind blows across the surface, grabs that heat, and takes it as a result. Now, the book recommends that you shield your pool from wind by installing trees or bushes. Now, let's be completely honest, though. If you're installing trees and bushes around your facility, what are you going to be doing but blowing a bunch of leaves into the pool? So, again, shielding your pool from wind as effectively as possible is great, but sometimes we're just going to have to take it on the nose when it comes to convection heat loss. Next, we've got radiation heat loss. So in those cold climates, think about a cold room and a warm fireplace. That warm fireplace is going to share the heat with the cold room. Your hot tub or your swimming pool is going to want to share its heat with the cold air. So as a result, it's going to shoot that air or that heat out into the air. And unfortunately, it's going to make you lose a lot of heat from your water itself. The recommendation is that you keep your air temperature 2 to 5 degrees warmer than your water temperature. If you do that, then you're going to see significantly less exchange of water heat to air heat. Now, again, unfortunately, in those colder climates, when you've got a hot tub on a 25-degree day, that's kind of an unavoidable situation. But again, making sure that we mitigate it as much as possible to save on those energy costs is going to be pretty huge. And then finally, we've got conduction heat loss. This is where the heat escaped your pool through the walls of the pool itself. This is 5% of your loss, and unfortunately, it's just unavoidable. But again, it's only 5%, so it's not a huge deal. Now, some people will talk and say, well, what about putting a cover on? A cover should help, right? Well, yes, a cover helps a ton. It reduces those losses by 50 to 70%. That's really enticing. That's really attractive. But what I will also say is covers come with some major drawbacks. These major drawbacks are the liability that are caused by covers. The number one cause of drowning in children under the age of, the number one cause of death in children under the age of 16 in the accidental realm is drowning. And one of the biggest causes of drowning is these covers. Kids will either walk over the surface of them and get trapped down in that solar cover, or they'll swim underneath it and not be able to get back out from under it. So again, covers can be really good, but oh mercy, the liability that comes from these. So if you are backed against the corner and you really need to save some money on energy costs, here's what I recommend you do. If your property's liability insurance policy will allow a cover in the first place, I recommend that you put it on the moment the pool closes and has everybody out of there. Make sure you put it on, and it will save you a lot of money during that closed period. Then in the morning, before anybody gets in there, before the pool opens, roll the cover off, store it away, and go about your day. If you do this, like I said, you're going to see some pretty major energy cost savings. But make sure that you never have that cover available to public access or on the pool during open hours because the liability is just too immense. Now, with our heat gains, we all love heat gains. We love warm water. There's a few different places where we get our heat gains. The first is coming from gas-fired heaters, one of our most common sources of heat out there. Next, we've got our heat exchangers. Now, heat exchangers can be found in larger buildings. What a heat exchanger does is it's basically a tube inside of a tube is the way that these are set up. And the outer tube is filled with water from that larger building's boiler. And the inner tube has water from your pool running through it. The heat transfers from the boiler water into your pool water and heats your pool very, very efficiently. It's really a great system. They're very expensive, but they do end up saving you a lot on costs because you're essentially double dipping on your energy costs. Now, solar and other alternatives. Here in Colorado, solar is a really, really helpful and really beneficial alternative source of heat. One of the big things that you want to make sure of, though, is when you're using solar heat on your swimming pool or your hot tub, make sure that you're having that water run through the lines consistently 24 hours a day, because on those hot days, if you don't have it running and it sits stagnant in there, it can actually reach or cause that water to reach boiling temperatures, and it can melt through the lines. So make sure that you are keeping those solar systems running as long as possible. Now, if you're curious about a heat pump, or if you're curious about geothermal heating, just check the book and you'll be able to see if those are good options for you. One of the big things to remember is make sure that you have your heater professionally installed. Make sure that you have your heater professionally installed. This means that whoever's installing it needs to pull the permit for that heater and make sure that they are installing the hood correctly. Without a vent hood installed correctly, you could risk carbon monoxide poisoning. So one of the big things that you also want to add inside of your pump room is a carbon monoxide detector. For anybody out there who's working on an indoor facility, I highly recommend that you also add a carbon monoxide detector into your pool facility itself, into the pool room. You want to make sure that you're gathering that carbon monoxide detection before it gets off the charts. Make sure that you're using a system that can actually be tweaked and set as far as the parameters go to go off between 36 and 99 parts per million once it detects those. So again, make sure that we have these professionally installed so that venting hood is properly venting all of that carbon monoxide away from you and your guests. Now, when it comes to air circulation is more put on an HVAC professional. Now, anybody who's setting the parameters for their HVAC systems at your properties, this information is for you. The standard is a 0.48 cubic feet per minute of circulation velocity on there. The reason why we're doing this is twofold. One, it helps keep our guests comfortable. It makes our facilities not feel like they're sitting in a wind tunnel and freezing out when that wind blows through and hits their bodies. Next, what's going to happen is that 0.48 cubic feet per minute of velocity is also going to move something called our combined chlorine out of the air. Now, really quickly, the way this works is whenever chlorine's floating through the water and it interacts with some sort of contaminant, that chlorine combines with the contaminant and essentially kills it off. Once it kills that contaminant off, that combined chlorine that it has become, once it combines itself to the contaminant, then evaporates out of the pool. Once it evaporates out of the pool, it floats in the air. And this is where we start smelling that chlorine smell. The chlorine smell, make a note of this, the chlorine smell is called a chloramine. It's called a chloramine. Now, with those chloramines, they are harmful to respiratory systems, their skin irritants, and their mucous membrane irritants like our eyes, things like that. So we want to move it out of there. Now, the big thing that this makes us all think is how many times have we walked into a pool facility and it just smells like chlorine? Well, that's not chlorine we're smelling. We're smelling the byproduct of dead chlorine, the chloramines. Now, for all of us who have indoor pools, don't start feeling guilty about this. Realistically, all of our pools would smell like this if we had no air circulation. The reason why you're smelling more chloramines inside of those indoor facilities is because we just need to simply bump up our air circulation a little bit more to blow it out, and we'll be just fine. A 50-50 fresh air and recirculated air split is a minimum requirement for our air circulation, and 100% fresh air is ideal. Outdoor pools, you got that like no one's business. Now, everybody, even if you're not setting your HVAC parameters, make sure you write this one down. Mechanically cooled therapeutic pool areas should have 4 to 6 air exchanges per hour. If you need to pause the video and write that down, feel free to do so. Mechanically cooled therapeutic pool areas should have 4 to 6 air exchanges per hour. Who does this apply to? This applies to hospitals that are air conditioned that have a physical therapy or a therapy pool inside of their facility. So to put that into perspective, that's about 1% of operators out there. I don't know why this is in there, but make sure you write it down because you will be asked this question. Now, for all of us, it's not like we can lick our fingers, stick it in the air, and be like, well, that's some good air circulation. Realistically, we're going to need to have an HVAC professional come in and set the parameters for our facilities to make sure that they are matching these requirements. Now, that's the end of our chapter. Make sure that you write down any questions that you may have for our Q&A session.